Understanding culture and customs is a really important part of your travel experience. So let's explore a little bit. First of all, what are we talking about? What is culture? There's so many different definitions, but here's one that I like to use. The shared knowledge and systems of meaning in a society. Basically, how a society organizes itself around certain symbols and knowledge about how people should behave, how they should interact, what their values are, and what their beliefs are. They are the social and behavioral norms in a society. Basically, the glue that keeps a society together in terms of expectations about how people should interact, how they should behave, and what they should do. And these things are passed down intergenerationally through different generations. And that's basically how culture continues and perpetuates itself. The older generation teaches and passes these expectations and these norms and these behaviors down to the next generation. What is a custom? A custom is a little more narrowly defined. It's basically a traditional, widely accepted way of behaving that is specific to a particular society, place, or time. That's pretty similar to culture, but culture encompasses a much wider range of things. Things like values and beliefs and traditions. However, customs are more specifically defined as behaviors, things that people do. So customs are actually part of a larger culture. There's this idea called the cultural iceberg, and this basically says that there are certain aspects of culture that are easily seen, observed, and identified. These are things on the surface. Things like food and language and music and ways of dress and the flags that are associated with the culture, holidays, performing arts, visual arts. These are all things that are on the surface and that we can easily point to and say that's a part of culture. But just like an iceberg, there's a whole lot of culture that's underneath the surface. Sometimes it's referred to as deep culture. And these are the things that are often the unspoken or even unconscious beliefs that actually influence those things that are more observable. Things like values and body language, gender roles, ways of leadership styles, even something as basic as notions of the self. Who is a person? Who is an individual? Attitudes towards age, attitudes towards social status, etiquette rules, expectations around politeness, religious beliefs. There's so many things, even things such as the importance of time, how people approach time, notions of cleanliness, approaches to problem solving. These are all of the unspoken, deep level cultural things that we often can't really point our finger to or easily observe, but they are actually probably much more important than those surface level cultural things. So once again, culture is such a wide range of values, beliefs, and practices. Things such as language, religion, food, folk art, but other things that aren't so easily identifiable or easy to point out. Child rearing methods. Sometimes there can be very subtle or small differences in how different cultures approach child rearing. Things like how you actually express your manners. In one culture, you might think it's important to always say please and thank you. And in another culture, that might actually be considered rude because it might indicate that you think the person is not supposed to actually extend their courtesy to you. So there's so many parts of culture, many seen and many unseen. And part of travel is that you get to experience some of the joys of experiencing different cultures. Things that activate your senses. I call it a very visceral experience. Things like new foods, experiencing or listening to different music and the dances that go along with it, participating in different festivals. So many people travel around the world to go to different carnival festivals, music festivals. There's a festival in the desert in Mauritania. So there's so many parts of culture that are so exciting, interesting customs and traditions. You can learn a lot by going, for example, to weddings or observing things like baby naming ceremonies. What do societies do with a baby when a mother first gives birth, and how do they treat the mother when she first gives birth. There's so many opportunities to observe some of these interesting customs and practices and traditions. There are also opportunities to actually learn about things, big topics like history and art and ancient civilizations by going and experiencing a new culture. So these are very exciting and joyful parts of new cultures. Again, once you see things like how people dress, you also might get a glimpse into things like how men and women are expected to relate to each other, or how older people and younger people are expected to relate to each other. What people do at weddings or other festivities and celebrations. Very joyful things to experience. Other traditions around food and things like hospitality. In many cultures, serving tea or coffee, or even having ceremonies around how you specifically serve people tea and coffee. Those are part of some of the traditions and customs that are very important. Things such as what you do with a bride when she's about to get married, or what you do with a young person when they're about to go off to school. So, again, very fascinating and interesting experiences around experiencing different cultures. The other thing is experiencing other different cultures or other cultures can cause you to actually reflect on your own culture and be more mindful and aware of what are some of the values, the surface level cultural values, and also some of the deeper cultural values that are important to you. So you actually become more curious about your own culture and customs. Maybe there are things that you didn't know about your own culture and customs that you're now curious about and want to research. But you also get to see how connected we are. So part of experiencing different cultures, different being the operative word, is that you see how divergent and how different we are all across the world. But you also get to see some commonalities, especially when you see things like weddings and baby naming ceremonies and even customs around death. You see that these are often experiences that we all have despite our differences in cultural backgrounds. So you get to actually see how connected we all are. And that can be a pretty profound experience. And as a result, you actually can learn more about yourself. I always say that one of the aspects of travel that really facilitates self learning and self knowledge is interacting with vastly different cultures. Very, important to contemplate who you are in the wider scheme of the world and being a world citizen. But we also know that one of the ways that cultures differ is through values. Again, those deeper level things that influence the surface level cultures. And so there have been many researchers that have pointed out some of the key ways that societies across the globe differ in terms of their cultural values. One is what's called this continuum of what we call individualism versus collectivism. Individualism is where you give priority to individuals, and that's sort of what we see in many Western cultures, that it's really about what you as an individual want. What are your preferences? What are your goals? What is it that you want to do? But societies that focus more on collectivism, they give more of a priority to the group cohesion, that it's important to go along, for example, with what your family wants or what your ethnic group wants or what your society wants, that group cohesion and priority to the group's goals are more important than priority to individual goals. There's something else called high power distance versus low power distance. And in a society that values high power distance, there's more of a hierarchical social structure. That it's really important that you respect people's titles and their status, whether it's something like a government official or a chief of a village or the patriarch or matriarch of the family, that hierarchy within the family and even in workplaces is very important to respect and sometimes very rigid. Societies that have more of a low power distance, again, may focus more on equal treatment, that it really doesn't matter what your status or your title is, that people can, be expected to interact equally. There's another dimension that's called quantity of life versus quality of life. Quantity of life might be where there's a focus, again, in many Western societies on valuing competition and achievement and reaching your individual goals versus being more focused on valuing relationships. For example, focusing on taking care of the elderly, even if it's at the expense of your individual achievement or goals. So it's that quality of focusing on relationships that can be much more important than any individual goals. Also, there's this idea of high uncertainty versus low uncertainty societies. In high uncertainty societies, people in general, the society in general, tends to avoid uncertainty. So, not necessarily going out and doing activities that are, considered adventurous if it's not known what the outcome would be. That people in these sort of societies would tend to be much more focused on continuing customs, traditions, doing things the way they've always been done. And in low uncertainty societies, people seem to be more comfortable with uncertainty, trying the unknown, doing even things like travel, right? Traveling to unknown places. This might be a value that's associated with a low uncertainty society because people might feel more uncomfortable with exploring the unknown. And then finally, there's this idea of a long-term focus versus a short-term focus. And societies that have a long-term focus, they're constantly thinking about the future. People might be raised to really focus on what they're going to do next, what the future generations are going to do, planning 10, 15, 20, and future generations ahead. Where short-term societies might focus more on a present focus where you really focus on a day-to-day, what your relationships, what's going on in your immediate surrounding, and keeping that stable as opposed to really thinking too far ahead in the future. So these are some general ways that societies might differ in their values and the way that values may differ across cultures, and they could influence things such as the decisions that people make, how they interact with authority figures, how they plan for their future or not, or even the activities that they're willing to participate in. So I've always found this very fascinating because these differences can often account for some of the more tangible differences that we see in people's behaviors and traditions and practices across cultures. So, given those differences, there actually can be many difficulties in interacting with different cultures. And, as you see with those different values, worldviews can clash. And this can lead to misunderstanding in the meaning of behavior. So one person might do something and have one intention behind it, but it could be misunderstood or misinterpreted in terms of the intention or meaning. And expressions of values and even politeness can often be misinterpreted. So, just in terms of how you should greet each other in a first meeting, and this is something that is often talked about in terms of cross-cultural business interactions. So this is an Asian man who's saying, "Why is she trying to shake my hand?" And she is saying, "Why is he bowing?" This is a clash of worldviews, of expressions of politeness, where the way that each of these parties thinks that you show politeness and hospitality and greet someone is completely different. So these are some of the downsides, some of the clashes that come with cultures. Even in terms of how women are viewed in terms of their dress in a society. So on the left, you have a woman who is, espousing a Western view of what's acceptable for women to wear. And she's looking at the woman on the right who's from a Middle Eastern culture. And she's saying everything is covered but her eyes. What a cruel male-dominated culture. And the woman on the right from the Middle Eastern background is saying nothing covered but her eyes. What a cruel male-dominated culture. So they both see each other as somewhat being oppressed. And this is because there are different worldviews, different values about how women should be presenting themselves in public, the values around modesty and so forth. And there's a special note about language, how language can actually be one way that that cultural clashes are expressed. And so, very important values are often reflected in speech and language. And I don't mean necessarily if you're speaking a different language, even if both people are speaking Spanish or English or French, but they're coming from different cultural backgrounds. There can be misunderstandings that come from things like asking inappropriate questions. So, in some Western countries, it's okay to go up and make small talk with people and ask certain questions about their political views or even their religion. But in other societies, those kinds of questions might be considered rude or too intrusive. So even if people are speaking the same language, so to speak, their actual way of communicating is different because of their culture. There could be misunderstandings that come from failing to apologize. So I know in some cultures where there's large crowds, there it's very crowded, and personal space often, there's very little personal space. People might be bumping up against you or being really close to you. And people from societies where if you even just violate someone's personal space a little bit, you would apologize. And so in those two instances, there might be a cultural clash where in the society that's used to big crowds, an individual wouldn't even, think to apologize if they stepped on your foot or brushed past you or shoved you, and the other person is expecting an apology. Also, there have been a lot of language clashes around giving compliments that seem rude. And so this even happened to me once where I was interacting with a woman who had, this was in Sudan actually, and she had a newborn baby who was a few months old, and he was such a cute little baby. And I noted, and he was a very chunky baby, and I noted how he was very cute and such a big chunky baby. And everybody looked because they thought that that was a compliment that was inappropriate and it seemed rude. Okay, so, and it wasn't a matter of language. I was actually speaking to her in Arabic, the little bit of Arabic that I knew, but just that type of compliment was considered rude. And so many important values are reflected in speech and language, and therefore this can be a source of misunderstandings, whether you speak the language or you're trying to learn the language. So the takeaway around understanding different cultures and customs is that awareness is key. First of all, just basic awareness that differences are often unseen and unspoken. That there can be differences that you can see, such as the way people dress, the foods that they eat, the holidays that they celebrate, the religions that they practice. But so many differences are actually unseen and unspoken. Things like how you give a compliment, or what you do if you bump into someone, or how you are expected to greet someone. These things are often unseen and unspoken, and even they're unconscious to the members of the society because it's just a part of the culture that they're used to practicing. So another important thing is that awareness of your own surface and deep level culture can be really important. Just thinking to yourself, how much personal space do I value? Or am I expecting? And that can help you to be aware of when you go somewhere and you notice that personal space is treated differently. So it will make it, much easier for you to see that as a cultural difference than to see someone else as being rude or trying to hurt you or trying to do something negative. So awareness of your own surface and deep culture can really help you to identify when there's a possible clash of cultures, there's a possible misinterpretation or misunderstanding. So, that said, you have a cultural awareness challenge. Number 1, you are to identify one cultural value or custom from your own culture. And when I ask people to do this, it's usually pretty simple, but sometimes people feel like, wait a minute, what is my culture? Do I even have a culture? What are customs? What are values? So sometimes it might take a little bit for you to really think about and identify your own cultural values and customs. But this is very important for that key takeaway, which is awareness of your own background. And then number 2 is you should identify one cultural value or custom from the next country you plan to visit. So, up to this point, we've been doing a lot of research and a lot of challenges around helping you to figure out where you are definitely going next or where you think you might want to go next. So, maybe you've already pinpointed it, or maybe you just have a few options in mind. Either way, just pick a country that you think you might plan to visit next and do a little research. You have your websites that we've talked about in the previous section, and you can identify one cultural value or custom from that country. And then take a minute to see if there's any difference between what you identify as your own cultural value or custom and what you've identified from the country that you plan to visit. And so, one of my favorite authors who wrote The Alchemist and who really understands the power of understanding culture and travel says culture makes people understand each other better. And if they understand each other better in their soul, it is easier to overcome the economic and political barriers. But first, they have to understand that their neighbor is, in the end, just like them, with the same problems, the same questions. And so I think that harkens back to one of the benefits of interacting with different cultures is that you get to see that despite so much difference in the divergence in values and customs and practices and beliefs, at the core, we're all just groups of humans who are striving to, have to answer some basic questions and to live a quality life. So I'll leave you with that. And I hope that you can really get something beneficial out of this challenge of identifying your own cultural values and beliefs and customs and that of the next country that you plan to visit. Good luck.